A Science of Change, podcasting by Gilmore Crosby, social scientist, author, and organization development professional since 1984. Welcome. This is Gil Crosby again, excited to be with you and to be with my special guest, John Scherer, who is with me once again. And John is an eminent OD historian and practitioner and a part of the founding faculty of the Leadership Institute of Seattle, a friend, a mentor, good friend of my father's. And so, John, it's just exciting to have you here once again. And this time, as you know, I was hoping to hear more of your wisdom about the way you weave. Well, you have vast knowledge of spirituality. And I think OD at its best in its social justice mission, even in its the way that we can help create more alive experiences for individuals and for organizations, is spiritual in nature. And so,
it's great to be back with you, Gil. This is just fabulous. And I was thinking about how spirituality and OD live inside of me, and I realized that from the very first time that I've experienced, kind of got an introduction to what OD was, they have not seemed separate at all. And I was thinking about when this happened. I was a consultant, an OD consultant back in the 1980s to the U.S. Army, believe it or not. I was on the faculty. They had a program back in those days called the OESO program, introducing OD to the organization effectiveness, they called it, to the Army. And I was on the faculty. It was an amazing experience. And right about that time, this guy was doing some work inside the Army, creating a kind of a Delta Force, not a military, but a kind of a Zen kind of a concept. And basically, that slogan came out of that group, which is be all you can be. And I remember being kind of ticked off that the Army had picked such a great slogan, be all you can be, because that to me is what all the world's religions are about. I don't care whether East, West, wherever they come from, the intention of a religion or a spiritual path is to help people, and I would say systems, that's the jump to OD, but to help people be all they can be live into the fullness of their potential. And so when I discovered OD, it was like, oh, so this gives me a methodology for helping individuals, teams, and larger systems become all they can be. So to me, it's almost like a natural connection.
That makes sense. And the Army makes sense. I mean, you have your roots in your Navy experience also.
Yeah. It's hard for me to tell the story about the Army, but I could also relate it to my 4 years as a combat officer on a U.S. Navy destroyer. Yeah. I remember the XO one time walked up to me and he said, "Mr. Scherer, what are we running here? A ship of war or a psychiatric clinic?" And I remember waggling my feet because everybody was talking to me about their problems. I don't know. I'd say, "Hello, how you doing?" And they'd start telling me, "Well, my wife ran off with this Marine," and all this kind of stuff. And so I was doing. Anyway, yeah, you were going to say something.
Well, you were a Lutheran pastor by then.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's the other half of the story is I was in the Navy trying to figure out what to do. I don't tell this story very often. And I was I'd been in almost 4 years and wasn't sure what to do. And I remember sitting in my stateroom, which sounds elegant, but it's just a small room where I lived when I was on the ship. And I think looking back on it, I was in a kind of a meditative state, a deep state. And this voice, I heard a voice, Gil, as clear as your voice right now. John, be with people at the level of their deepest need. And I was an air controller, right? So I remember thinking, say again, over, And John, be with people at the level of their deepest need. And I wrote it down. I wish I could find that yellow pad. I'd love to find that pad. And I remember thinking, could you be a little bit more specific, But no, that was it. And so I immediately sat down and made a list of all the jobs, all the roles that I knew of that was being with people at the level of their deepest need. And I had teacher and social worker and YMCA executive and, all kinds of things. And I had minister down because my grandfather, who was a Lutheran pastor, and I have 4 generations of Lutheran pastors on my father's side.
Wow.
And he was my hero up until my pop decided to be a newspaper man / alcoholic. So that kind of broke the chain. But I put minister down. And then I thought, okay, I'm gonna go to seminary. I'm gonna give this a shot because I saw how powerful and significant my grandfather's presence was in literally every room that he walked into. I remember sitting in the front hall of the parsonage. My first 5 or 6 years, I grew up in the parsonage, which was connected to the church. And people would come in kind of, upset or look kind of frown face, and they would go in to his study and be with him for an hour or so, and they'd come out smiling and hugging. And I remember thinking, what's going on in there? What's he doing in there with those people? And I realized that almost by osmosis, I was around the possibility of transformation in people's lives. I saw it, even though I didn't know what it was until much later in my life.
It's a great story, John. And it reminds me of an influence on you. That's a big influence on me too. Is Carl Jung. And,
absolutely.
And how he was convinced that not everything can be explained through science, including that voice that you heard.
Exactly. Now, you can make a case for this being my preconscious or my subconscious or my archetype inside talking. That's fine. I don't care where it came from. I don't have to have some divine being off in the sky somewhere. And that's another thing, Gil, that's happened to me over the years. Somehow or other, in my breast milk and my oatmeal in those first 5 or 6 years, growing up in the parsonage with my grandfather, even though he was a Lutheran pastor, 50 years, same church. He was the bishop of the synod, the president of the synod of all the Lutherans in the state of Virginia, right? So I was literally brought up in the church build. I'd run around and play in the church building. So the church was kind of a part of my early life. But somewhere I did not get, thank God, so to speak, I did not get imbued with this very rigid, we're right, everybody else is wrong kind of attitude about my faith. It was like God was a real being. I remember my grandmother. I remember saying something about God, and I remember I was like 3 or 4 years old. I have vivid memory sitting by this window in the parsonage, and she said, "Well, Johnny, look out there. Can you see the leaves moving, blowing?" And I said, "Yes." She said, "Well, what's blowing the leaves?" And I said, "Well, I guess it's the wind." This is how she tells the story back. And she said, "That's kind of like God. We can't see God, but God is a force in our world." And that sort of is. So I got a lot of metaphors rather than the Bible being a literal truth about whatever happened. It was more like these are stories that can help us understand our lives. So when I got to seminary after the Navy, so after that voice spoke to me, signed up for seminary, went to seminary and loved it. I was like a kid in a candy store because I grew up, with Bible stories. I always won the Bible contest. All the other kids didn't want to be in the room. They didn't want to play with me because I always knew all the answers. So when I got to seminary, I was just really loving it. And somewhere along the line, and so every time I was preaching to people, Gil, the challenge was, how do I take this story that meant something to people apparently over a period of about 100 years as the stories kept getting told and retold and told and retold. This story made it through this Darwinian process. It didn't fall off. I used to do stand-up comedy magic, and so if I told a joke and nobody laughed, that joke did not show up the next time I did a magic show. But if people laughed, I go, okay, I'm going to keep that one. So the stories that we have are the stories that continued to move people and touch people for whatever reason. And so I was just, my first book was on the parables of Jesus, his stories that changed people's lives, transformational encounters. And so I didn't grow up with this, with God being some old man off in the sky somewhere. And then I remember about 5 or 6 years ago, well, in a sermon, I was trying to connect. I'm realizing that most people sitting out there have this cosmology where there's an old man, God living off somewhere who in some vague way is managing what's happening on the world. And you have this whole continuum. Some people think that God is controlling everything, and some people, and so, gosh, how do I say something about this story that was meaningful 2,000 years ago? What is it saying to me? And how can I speak a word of potential deep transformation to this group of people that represent a whole range of ways of thinking about God and Jesus and everything else? And I love that. I love the challenge of preaching because it was forcing me to speak my own truth as whatever the Spirit was telling me into their language. And then about, I don't know, 10 or 15 years ago, it dawned on me that even that cosmology had now modified. It was like the old skin of a snake had kind of sloughed off, and I no longer had any kind of concept of a divine being, an entity off somewhere. That God had kind of morphed into, like may the force be with you. It sounds kind of, cliched, but some kind of an energy or force of some kind. And so I miss that old guy, that I had vaguely in the back of my mind, I remember asking my grandfather, what is prayer? When I was like 9 or 10, 11 years old, and I can still see him sitting in this black chair in the study. And he said, well, Johnny, for me, it's like I crawl up in God's lap and I just sit there, and after a while, everything is okay. and I thought, okay, I get this.
Uh-huh.
And I miss that guy. That old lap that I could crawl up and get into.
It would be reassuring to have it be that concrete.
Absolutely. So when it comes to OD, the interesting thing is that I never, and I do a lot of leadership development, as you know, but I never talk about my cosmology or about my faith. I speak from it rather than about it. I have no need or desire to convert anybody to anything except to the possibility of becoming all they can be. And so,
Sure.
So all the stories that are in my closet or in my background, those are reference points for me, metaphors that empower and enable me to speak, hopefully, to people in the present world, not about my faith, but from my faith.
Mm-hmm. I do something similar, and drawing on quotes and so on.
I know you do.
One thing that just occurred to me as you were speaking about your grandfather is, of course, I have a grandfather who was a Presbyterian, I believe, except I think Dad would correct me on that.
I think
he was a Methodist.
Yeah.
I think he is a Methodist.
Yeah.
But I always thought of him as a Presbyterian for some reason. But anyway, Louis Freeze, and I have his harmonica.
I'll be done.
I'm gonna blow one note. This is what I use now in all the workshops we do to have people shift their attention from talking in pairs and.
Sure, it's like ringing the bell. Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's beautiful. I love this. Yeah. I love the metaphor, Gil.
Yes, that's grandfather's harmonica through which his breath.
Yeah, wow.
Went over and over. So there's anyway. I share that the force is akin to my thoughts about what's God, and to me it's everything and everything that ever was, everything that ever will be, an energy.
Yeah.
That I'm already part of.
Exactly.
So that's one thing I like about it is I don't have to wait.
Yeah. Well,
I'm already part of it.
Yeah.
And
well, that's a really cool thing that's become crystal clear to me in the last few years, actually. For many years, when I moved to Spokane after the Navy and after seminary, I went to Cornell as the pastor and the Lutheran chaplain at Cornell, and then in the middle of that, your dad, Bob Crosby, I was called out of the ministry into the work of applied behavioral science, and your dad was God's mouthpiece for that event. I was on my way to a conference in Green Lake, Wisconsin, to do a workshop, and there was this little quiz that I was taking on the airplane where you fill out these little things and rating, and afterward you could figure out which one of the 5 or 6 laboratories that were going on you should be in. And I thought I was going to go to one on communication, but when I filled it out, it said, no, you should go to this one on conflict, which was led by your dad, Bob Crosby. And that event changed my life, Gil, because I remember on the second or third day of this thing, Bob came up to me and he said, "What are you doing in this program?" And I said, "Well, I'm really enjoying it." He said, "No, why are you a participant?" He said, "Man, you should be on the staff for this thing." And I said, "Well, I'm just really loving it." He said, "Next year, I want you to be on the staff with me." So the next year, I went back to Green Lake, Wisconsin, and that was my first kind of introduction to applied behavioral sciences. And basically, I tell people in Poland, where I was living for the last 16 years, a very Catholic country, they go, "Why'd you leave the ministry, John?" And I said, "Well, I use their language. Well, God called me out of the ministry into this work."
Mm-hmm.
And I'll say, "Why don't you wait till this workshop's over, and then we'll have this conversation." And then quite often they'll go, "Oh, I get it. Okay." They use their like this. This is your ministry, and I go, "Yeah, okay, yeah, that's it."
So it's again a lovely story and a good example of a miracle.
Yeah, I think so. Exactly. So that's how I got into the applied behavioral sciences. It was just a natural step to the side. It gave me a technology for operationalizing my faith. I'll say it that way, if I need to be technical about it. It gave me a way to go into a room full of people, and instead of talking at them or preaching to them, it was being with them and inviting them into a conversation internally and with other people that had the potential to awaken them to more possibility in themselves, in the system, and everything else. So actually, I got into OD through family systems. I was a Gestalt therapist. I was introduced to Gestalt in a workshop and fell in love with it, and was doing Gestalt therapy with people. And then what happened is every time they would talk about somebody a lot, because I was also interested in family systems, oh, well, whoever, get the whole system in the room is an old thing I came up with. I remember thinking, we need to have, you're talking about your wife a lot, she needs to be in the room, or your husband, she needs to be in the room next week. In fact, this one couple, this guy was complaining about the dog. He said, John, the dog loves my wife. My wife loves my wife loves the dog more than she loves me. And he kept talking about it. I said, okay, next week, bring the dog. So they brought the dog to this. I swear to God, I can still see this. So I had an extra chair, it's an old Gestalt concept. So I had I had this dog. It was these little teeny little dogs. And he would sit in this big chair, and I had the guy talk to the dog. And he was going, are you? And he was pissed off at the dog. My wife loves you more than she loves me. And then I said, okay, now trade. So I said, sit in the chair. And I had the dog sit. And I said, now be the dog. This is a true story, Gil. And he looked. I said, look at Tom, whoever it was, in the chair, and talk to Tom. So he's sitting in this chair talking to the dog, and he says, hey, I'm just a dog, okay? It's not my fault. You should talk to your it's about you and your wife. This is not about me. Anyway, it was just, so that's how I got into family systems. And then I realized that the stuff that people had to deal with at night after supper and in the evening was created a lot of times in the workplace. And so I began to realize that people are bringing home a lot of the crap that they had to deal with was triggered in the workplace. And then I discovered that people are creating their family of origin stuff, their relationships at work. So all of that just moved me from one-on-one counseling to couples work to family systems work. So it was a natural step to OD.
Makes sense. I was going to say that of course, family systems therapists want the whole system.
Absolutely. That's what I'm saying. That's where I first heard that concept. I remember reading Virginia Satir and thinking, okay, now I get it. Yeah.
But I think taking the dog into the room was perhaps, a historically unprecedented intervention, John.
I've never heard of any.
That's a first.
I've never heard of anybody else doing that. I don't tell that story very often because I'm not sure many people would appreciate it. But
Sounds wise to me.
yeah.
So,
Well, it worked, as I recall. That's probably why I'm still telling the story, because as I recall, it forced the two of them to talk, and the dog was just sitting there panting in the other chair, you know.
uh-huh. So,
Yeah.
I mentioned, I mean, one of the things that I love about you, amongst many things, is you have knowledge that I certainly don't have of the ancient languages
Mm-hmm.
and sources,
Mm-hmm.
and so we'll be in like the group chat where we're sending emails. There's a OD net list. Back in the day, it seemed like high tech. But anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
now there's just old people
Yeah,
left on the list.
exactly.
But you know,
All the
like
people that haven't
I
learned
said
how
to
to
you.
use social media, we're still in, yeah, right.
Anyway, so here you were talking about uh, the biblical word for
Yeah,
holy.
Kodesh. Yeah, 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 yeah. All of those. I love the creation story in Genesis. That is just rich, rich, rich. We could do a whole thing just on that. But one of the things is when something is holy, um, it means separated, different from. And since the Hebrew, see, Greek and Hebrew are very different. Um, the biblical the Hebraic language, that family of languages, is made up of all verbs. Any noun like justice, that in the Greek, justice is an abstraction. The perfection of it lives somewhere else, up in heaven or somewhere. For the Greeks, there are these abstractions that, like justice is a concept, a noun. In the Hebrew tradition, it's a verb. It means just action. It means just behavior. It means doing things that are just. And so I love that about the Hebrew. It's the world is a happening place, you know. And so
It's all
it's
action.
all the nouns are verbal derivatives. Okay, so holy means pulled apart, separated from, and in many contexts, it seems to me it means separated. Like when you look at a bunch of iron filings and you pull a magnet underneath it. The iron, some of the, and you have a bunch of other things there. The iron filings will be separated out from the non-iron filings. But I like to think that in that process they're being separated towards something. They're being pulled by the magnet. So to be holy, you got movement going in two directions. You're being separated from things, but you're being separated by a force that moves you toward things. So that's, to me, that's a very, very important concept in OD and in the whole spiritual development world.
Kind of gets back to that uh, force
Yeah, exactly, exactly,
concept,
exactly, exactly.
which I like to think is love,
There you go.
infused with
There you
love,
go.
the whole universe.
That's it. I think you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of precedence for that. I don't talk about this much either for obvious reasons, but I had a very significant spiritual experience at a yoga ashram. Actually, um, I had an out of the body experience and all that. And two figures came into the room. One was Jesus, and the other was the spiritual teacher uh, of the guru at that ashram, who had died a couple years before. And there was
Hmm.
some kind of a transfer of knowledge or wisdom. It seems really spooky to talk about it, but it was like I felt this energy, and I was given like a download of a bunch of stuff. And I remember thinking, having the thoughts, wow, what, and reaching in and trying to get some thoughts, because it was just a download of pure energy. And one of the things that came to me was, in this download, was that everything is just energy vibrating in like different frequencies, and that the best word that we have for what it is that is vibrating is love. That everything is love vibrating in a different frequency. And it's like, wow, so when I came out of this experience, I was wasted. I mean, I could hardly walk. And anyway, that's another story for another time. But that hour and a half, 2 hour experience, that also changed my life. It was like, okay. And actually, my wife, Catherine, said she saw something in my eyes. After that, she saw me walking down the hill back to the ashram from that thing. And she said she could tell from 100 yards away that something had happened. So anyway, so those are all things that have shifted my consciousness, my thinking about all this. It's like there's a lot. Jung was absolutely right. There's stuff that we just don't understand. We sometimes are given a peek behind the curtain,
Mm-hmm.
and I think I was given that little peek behind the curtain.
Yeah, he was very empirical about
Yes.
how he writes.
Yes.
So there was enough evidence
Yep.
of stuff
Yep.
that can't be explained to make it credible that
Yep.
it is that that it's real in some way. And it's hard to talk about experiences like that, but I'm glad you just did. That sounds like an amazing blessing.
Well, Gil, many people don't know this, but I was in a PhD program in parapsychology while I was on the LIOS faculty. One of my dear friends and mentors was a guy named Dr. Stanley Krippner, who was one of the top parapsychologists for decades in America. He's 90-something years old. He's still alive. I'm going to visit him soon. And
didn't he do shows?
Well, yeah.
Krippner?
Yeah, I think I had him come to LIOS to do a couple lectures on conscience, but we studied action at a distance and psychic healing and dreams and a whole bunch of other things. And so,
sure rings a bell.
Yep.
I gotta look him up after we're done.
Yep, and he's
Stanley Krippner.
Yeah,
okay.
And so I've got all of his books over here and everything. But he was a significant influence in my life, and it's interesting to me that it never occurred to me to wonder. But what Stan was doing, he wasn't like doing psychedelic drugs to check out. He was doing research. He was saying, if there's something happening that we cannot explain using normal psychology or physics or whatever, then we have to go we have to go alongside of regular psychology. This is parapsychology. Then we need to figure out what the heck is going on here. So he was a researcher all around the world. In fact, because of my interest in magic, and I was a magician for many years, he would take me on some of his research. I remember in Mexico, there was this woman who was a healer, and Stan brought me along. I remember we went to Cuernavaca, just outside of Cuernavaca, Mexico, and she would take an egg. Somebody would bring an egg, and she would use the egg and scan the person's body and crack the egg, and inside the egg would be different gristle and stuff. And so Stan brought me along to make sure she wasn't like switching eggs and stuff like that. And I was watching her like a hawk. Doña Maria was her name. Anyway, and she told Stan, I think you have a problem with your pancreas or whatever it was. And so, we after a while we left, and I said, Stan, do you have any problem with your pancreas? He said, I don't think so, John. And then about 3 or 4 months later, he calls me. He said, guess what? I'm in the hospital for, stuff in my pancreas or whatever the organ was. But from Stan's point of view, you see, maybe she planted a seed in his mind that he had an issue, and his mind, which is very powerful in our body, created something in that particular organ. Hypnotists, which we've studied too, a hypnotist will tell somebody that I'm going to burn you with a cigarette and touch them with a pencil eraser, and a blister will show up. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So there's all this. The body, mind, spirit connections are now being studied now with all the stuff that we can do, and AI is going to be helpful in this regard. Hopefully, we're going to find out about a lot more of these connections that we haven't understood. Well, Gil, I don't know. I go off on these tangents. I don't know what you want to talk about, man. But I'm happy to respond whatever you think would be interesting.
That's all right. I'm certainly enjoying this so far, and of course, it's possible that woman also somehow knew.
Yes, exactly. See, that's one of the possible explanations, is that she has been given. On the way out the door, in my limited Spanish, we were thanking her. And she said to me, I don't need the egg, the huevo. She said, the people, los ojos, the people need the egg. Isn't that interesting? In other words, she said, when your friend walked in, I knew what was happening, but I used the egg because the people need to see some kind of I just think it's fascinating, some kind of diagnosis.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now that reminds me of your knowledge of parables.
Yeah. Okay. Well, ask me a question.
Well, what's your favorite
Oh,
parable?
my Lord. Oh, my goodness. There's so many good ones. I think the prodigal son is certainly one of the two or three of my favorites. This guy had two sons, and the of course in that culture the older son got everything, inherited well almost everything, and so the younger
Mm-hmm.
son goes to his dad and says, "Dad, I'm out of here. Give me whatever you can. Give me whatever my inheritance would be. I can't. I don't want to hang around here anymore." So he leaves, and he goes, quote, to a far country, which is code for not Jewish, right? Everybody in these stories, they're all Jews. So he goes off to a far country, which means outside the circle of his religion, and
Which could be anywhere
anywhere
around
around
there.
there, absolutely, all the
Okay.
anywhere in that part of the world, and so and
Uh-huh.
so he wastes he loses his money in wasted living. It's very clever how the story kind of cleaned it all up. But he was doing everything you could imagine, doing drugs and sex and whatever, and he just lost all in gambling, whatever. Make up whatever you want to make up. That's the point. And he loses all of his money, and he ends up having to work slopping pigs, feeding pigs. Now, if you're Jewish, you understand you cannot. This kid could not have done any more to place himself outside the circle of God's love, his father's love, his community's love, his religion. This guy is off. He's off the edge of the world. And then I love this line. He's slopping the pigs, and he comes to himself. Now that's in the Greek. He comes to himself. He came to himself in the past tense. And then immediately he says, I'm okay. I'm going to go back to my father. And then he starts planning what he's going to say. I'll tell him that I've really screwed up, and I just want to be back in the house, even as one of the servants. Okay, I'm really. And so he starts back, heads home. And then the next line almost always makes me cry. And then it says, and the father sees him coming from afar off. Now, you can imagine this dad sitting there looking down the road, if you use that as a metaphor, every day. I wonder if my son is going to come home. They didn't have internet, telephones. I wonder if I'm ever going to see him again. He's looking down the road, Gil. He spots him way, way down the road. He sees his son coming. So to me, that parable should be called the parable of the waiting father, not the prodigal son. But that's another story. So the son and the father runs to meet him. Now we're already starting to hear things happening that are very unusual. An old man, like old people, did not run. That was not whatever you call it. The etiquette. And old people just didn't run. But he runs to meet his son, and his son falls down on his knees and he starts to run the tape. Dad, I'm so. And the father picks him up, in the Greek, hug, embraces means chest to chest, legs to leg. This is a full body hug, and he embraces his son. And his son runs the tape. Dad, I'm so sorry. I just want to be a servant and in your family. And the dad says, absolutely not, absolutely not. He says, come here, and here, take the ring. He takes the family ring, which is like the credit card, because that's how you sign financial documents. It means he gives him the
Mm-hmm.
ring, and he says, no, 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 you're not going to go. You're gonna wear sandals in my house. Only the servants go barefoot, and all this stuff. And then he says, here, take this robe that we reserve for special people when they come to visit. And then he tells, hey, we're going to have a party, everybody. My son is home. Now, we'll put the older brother aside for a minute because he's really pissed off about all this, but that's another story. But this whole concept, I think if that's the only story if you could say you could only have one story, that would be hard for me to decide, but that would be one. That whatever God is pulling for us, whatever that energy, that source, or whatever, however you want to, we have to anthropomorph. We have to turn it into a person to even be able to talk about it. And that's why I'm a kind of a Zen Lutheran, because uh, as soon as we name something, it gives the good news is we then can talk about it and we can manipulate it and work with it. The bad news is it ain't that. The name is not the thing. whatever it is, house, well, we make them a name for, or I'm looking at my binoculars on my desk here. Well, that's just a name I put on whatever that structure is over there. So as soon as we name something like God, we reduce it to something that we domesticate it. We make it fit into our household, and in the process, we lose everything about it. So that's where I am with all of that. That whatever God is on our side, pulling for us to come home. And so it's no accident, Gil, that when I wrote my book a few years ago, I said, and when I created my 4-day leadership program, I said, when it comes to leadership development, you don't need to change yourself. You need to come home to yourself. And this changes everything. And that's where that whole thing started.
Well, thank you. Thank you, John. That's a beautiful story. I was tearing up.
Yeah.
And I like how you reframed it from the perspective of the father.
Your dad, Bob has been that kind of dad for you guys too. I've seen it over the years.
Yep, and I've got sons of my own.
There you go.
So.
Same here. I wish I could claim that kind of fatherhood for myself. I've been, I don't know what word I would use.
I'm sure perfect. You would rejoice. I'm sure you would rejoice if they were walking up the road.
Absolutely.
Right now,
oh yeah. So. Now I'm getting teary. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I think that this feels complete.
Well, that's great. That's great. That's great, Gil. I mean, there's so many levels to this. If you think about the field of OD and the field of theology, like what would theologians say to applied behavioral scientists, then that's a level of abstraction, which would be interesting. But I've just never, and I could have that conversation because I've taught, New Testament. I think the two things I know the most about would be the history of the Christian materials and how they how Jesus became God, basically, is one of the things I could talk about, and the parables of this man, and the applied behavioral sciences, OD. I think those are two topics that I could probably teach, at a relatively high level. But, so for me, that's not, I'm more interested in what happens. I'm very Hebraic. The academic world is more Greek oriented for me. And it's great. It's absolutely essential to understand the principles and the concepts behind it. But I've tended over my life to be more Hebraic I'm more interested in the practice of OD and the practice of spirituality.
Yeah, and the other word is religion.
Well, now, yeah, where that one, your dad, I know, has told you this because I turned him on to this. Religare, the word ligaments, we get the word ligaments from the same root in the Latin. The ligament connects muscle to bone. And religare means to be connected back or to be connected again. So to be religious means to be connected back again and again and again, which I think is kind of an interesting way to look at it.
I think it's a lovely way to look at it. I mean, it's so easy just to think of it as institutions and competing institutions and all the crimes that have been committed in the name of religion and so on, and there still are being committed to this very
Gil,
moment.
If the church back in the 80s, I was part of an organization. It was called ARABS originally, Association for Religion and Applied Behavioral Science. But some of our Jewish colleagues said, "Guys, can we, any chance we could change the name?" So,
the acronym,
ACC, Association of Creative Change from Religious and Other Social Systems. So it became ACC or Cross, and in that group were people from the churches, from the religions of the world, who were also beginning to discover applied behavioral science, OD, training, development, all that kind of stuff. And so I
embraced it quite a bit.
One of the early people. I wasn't one of the founders, but I was in that second cohort, so to speak, and ended up being for a while the president of that association. And that was what we were doing. We were trying to blend these two worlds of of theology and the organizational church. And see, I think if the church practiced OD, it would be more true to what its intention is. So that's why I was drawn to it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My current pastor, Unitarian pastor, has a doctorate in OD.
I bet he's a great pastor. Yeah.
He is a great pastor, and of course, then the binding together.
Yeah, there you go.
Is we're back to love again. At the root of that is it's a great hope for the concept of religion, to have it be one of binding people together.
Yeah, that's great.
Not just within their own faith either, hopefully, but across the world.
Yeah.
Well,
we can just call it good if you want. I'm not a.
It is good.
It is good, which is, of course. Oh, that's another great thing. Back to the creation story in Genesis. There's this one of the metaphors that says that God created. Let's say God created the oceans and looked and saw that it was good. And the word in Hebrew is tov. Mazel tov means lots of good. And the word good is totally inadequate. Totally inadequate. Better translation would be the Creator created the oceans and looked and said, "Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. That's what I had in mind. That's a piece of me out there in the world where you can see it. You want to learn something about me? Look at my ocean. That's tov." So what is tov is when the essence of who we are, the best of who we are, gets manifest out in the world where it can be experienced by other people. So that's what when something is good. So this call for me has been tovular to the max, Gil. This has been tov to the max for me.
Well, I appreciate that, John. Me too. Hey, I am going to pull right out of Genesis. I have a question.
Sure.
Since I have a pastor here. It says in my version of the Bible, and of course, there's a lot of different versions.
Yes, there are. Absolutely. And even in the Bible, there are different versions of the creation story. So go ahead.
New International Version.
Yeah.
1973. Anyway, so God created mankind in his own image.
Yeah.
In the image of God, he created them.
Plural, yes.
Yes, the male and female, he created them.
Yes.
Now, it seems to me that somewhat implies if male and female are both the image of God.
Yes.
That it's not so simple as most people interpret this thing. I mean, it's...
No. Well, let me just get off on this for a little bit. Let me tell you what. The word the word that's used, there's lots of different words for God, okay? So El in Hebrew just means a God. It just means a divine being. And in the creation thing it says and that God's breath, ruach, hovered over the abyss, and the word tohu v'bohu means womb. It means womb. So that the whole thing of creation happens in womb. And then to keep going, this El, which is just any God, later in the story in Genesis, that God is named as El, that is the God Shaddai, El Shaddai, which is the feminine plural for breast. It's the breasted God, the God of Genesis, the God of the Hebrew people for many years, when they were using El Shaddai, means the breasted one, the breasted God, the God with breast. So this is absolutely amazing. And then the word for love, let's come back to that. Love in Hebrew, the word for love in Hebrew is almost always prefaced by rechem, which is the Hebrew word for womb. So this whole thing is El Shaddai is the breasted one, and rechem is the womb or motherly love. So this right from the very beginning. If men see, the problem was that men took over the writing of all this stuff because they were the only ones that had the rights to do all that stuff, and they're not going to have women, do all this kind of thing. So I know I'm going to run into trouble with some people here, but when they wrote it, the power to create history lies with the ones who write the stories, and so all.
And they were the only ones who could interpret the stories also back in the day.
Exactly. So anyway, so we have this feminine energy, and Sophia, of course, wisdom and spirit, the Trinity. In other words, Jesus is the only masculine character in that trio. Just saying.
Well, that gives me more, it draws me more to the trio, even though I'm.
Me too, Gil. Yeah, this it doesn't drive me away. It makes it more real for me. Absolutely. These people are sitting around a campfire trying to, in the Bronze Age, for Pete's sake,
yes.
trying to figure out what the bleep is going on. So why do we have to assume that they knew more about science and physics and astronomy and everything? They were doing their best, man. And here we are. So we need to look at it as people doing their best and figure out what's the metaphor for us here. What can we learn from their struggle to try to explain everything? So anyway.
Right. Creation certainly seems like a feminine.
Yeah, absolutely. It's birthing. It's birthing something.
Right.
In fact, the verb to be on, means to birth. It means to be a cause. It means to bring something into existence. So being is creating. To be is to create.
And the earliest artifacts, spiritual artifacts in Africa and so on, are feminine.
Yeah. The pregnant women, with large breasts, and extended stomachs. Absolutely.
So they were maybe more in touch than we are today in some ways.
Well, everything about our religions all around, Asian, Eastern, Western religions, have been domesticated and kind of, made easier to digest. And in that process, I think, have lost the edge. There was an edge. Like there's an edge, to Jesus. He wasn't this sweet guy walking around loving everybody. Man, he was a stand for confronting oppression wherever he found it. Yeah, so he was a radical.
He said he came with a sword.
Yeah, he's a lot more like Saul Alinsky than Carl Rogers. You know what I'm saying?
An activist.
Yes, he was he was definitely a radical activist on behalf of this God that he saw like Abba, Daddy, as the head of the household. And so So his concept of the kingdom of God was, what if the world was being run by God as the householder, and us, those of us in the family, what kind of family would we have? Everybody would have just enough to eat. Everybody would have enough to eat. It's like if you look at the Lord's Prayer from that point of view, it's a picture of how life would be if God were the father of the family in those days. It had to be the dad. Wow, holy mackerel. Didn't know we were going to get into all this, pregnant women and everything. Here we are.
Miracles.
Absolutely. Well, Gil, I love what you're doing. I love this series. I love being here. I don't know who's going to listen, but I'm happy whoever is listening to this. If you got this far, I'm really glad you listened. I hope you found something meaningful here. So thank you for this opportunity, Gil.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure to help spread your wisdom around the world. And, it's not the biggest audience yet, but I think someday, maybe after we're all
that's for sure. I mean, it's all part of the legacy. If you send me the link, I'll send this out. To my network, and sometimes the network goes to a network, and so on. But
sure, cool.
All right.
Okay, love you, John.
All right, man. Love you back, Gil Crosby. Take care, brother.
Okay, you too. And that is a wrap. To everyone out there listening, thank you. Take care. Hey, I appreciate you listening. This, again, is Gil Crosby. And I want you to take advantage of what's available to you. I have many free materials. I am happy to talk to people about their situations. especially if you're trying to create change, either social change or organization change. We have frequent workshops that are available, T group workshops. If you have never been in a T group with us, then don't miss it in your life. It's many people have said to me, of all the trainings I've ever received, I got this one 30 years ago, and it's the only one that stuck with me. You're learning from your actual interactions with the other participants and with the faculty. The faculty are walking the same talk that they're teaching of behavioral skills. It's a training workshop. That's what the T stands for. This is done in the spirit of the creation of T groups by Kurt Lewin and his associates. It's for groups. It's for teams. That's how it was originally designed. It is a opportunity to learn about theory and put it directly into practice. Again, the original design, you learn things and then you put them into practice. It was not just all ambiguity, which is how some T groups, most are led today, where the faculty hardly says anything. That's not how this is designed. So join us for that. There's always workshops. There's the Leadership Institute of Seattle, which has certificate programs, a two-year program where you will learn from T groups and learn how to do all the organization development work that my father designed, most of it, and I continue that practice alongside my brother Chris and many other associates. So don't be a stranger. There's a lot going on. It's always changing. So be in touch, and it's on the website, crosbyod.com. I look forward to working with you in your organization or as you pursue things like reducing gun violence and decreasing racism in our society. Whatever your goals are, the social science of Kurt Lewin guides how to achieve those goals in a reliable way. And so that's what I apply and practice every day and invite you to.